Thank you very much for coming. With this keynote lecture tonight, we conclude the second day of the Young Researchers in Archaeometry 2024 conference. And I invite the President of Cyprus Institute, Professor Stavros Mallas, to say a few welcoming words.
Thank you, Kyriaki. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this continuation of a two-day series where we have very many young students. And I'd like to thank the ambassador, of course, and the deputy being here, the embassy for supporting us, the Department of Antiquities, and also for supporting us tomorrow, not only for the lecture. Welcome. I have something to say about your lecture. It interests me. It's a very important medical history as well. But tomorrow we're going to have a big event, which you're also supporting us. Evie is going to burn some biological material with some degree of caution. And so tomorrow is kind of a ritual. She's already preparing that, so putting the red outfit, so tomorrow is fire. Yes, okay, there you are. Okay, so I was looking at this title, and I thought, what shall I say? But I'm going to tell you something very interesting. Because the Mediterranean diet has been the most successful experiment that human beings carried out, obviously not a scientific one, which has actually resolved one of the most important controversies in modern medicine. You all know, at least the ones that go for a dietitian, that you shouldn't be eating meat, because if you eat meat, cholesterol goes up, fat, and if you have high cholesterol in your blood, then you have a high risk of heart disease. Well, Mediterranean diet applied, at least in these days, we were also, in Crete in particular, they have this diet. Scientists compare two populations eating a lot of meat and a lot of fat, one in Crete and one in Norway or Finland, one of these two. And they found that despite the fact they're consuming copious amount of fat, the ones in Crete had a 10 times less risk of heart disease. And of course, why did the people in Finland or Norway have 10 times more risk of heart disease? Because they were eating too many sweets. So you all very well know that there's a drug, a class of drugs called statins, which made pharmaceutical companies very, very rich, and is the biggest seller, is a blockbuster of all medicines, and it's been given to people having high cholesterol. But now it's all been reversed because people studied the Mediterranean diet and found out that it is the combination of fat plus sweets that actually have high risk of CVD, cardiovascular disease. So you can eat as much as you like, but don't eat your baklava after that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Mallas. And now I would like to invite the Deputy Head of Mission of the Spanish Embassy of Cyprus, which is sponsoring the keynote lectures, the reception, and the experimental part tomorrow, to say a few words.
Thank you, President, Director of the Department of the Antiquities Department, young researchers, professors, doctors, academicians, Kiri. Okay, I will be very brief. I will not delve into the intricacies of archaeometry because I am a diplomat and there are a lot of experts here, so I will leave it to you. But I want to convey a few messages. First of all, congratulations to the Cyprus Institute for this wonderful organization. You put together something very difficult. It's quite a feat to bring young researchers from all around the world and to gather them for 3 days and discuss. And So, and I read the program, it's very impressive. I would have liked to leave the embassy, escape, and listen to your lectures and participate on this, but alas, that was not possible. And also, this kind of event gives an idea of the very special contribution of the Cyprus Institute to this country. That maybe you have a local perception, but for a foreigner, it's quite striking to find such a solid institution with this projection in a small country like Cyprus. I also would like to convey our gratitude, the opportunity for us to be part of all of this and to bring our young Spanish talent here. And I don't know if somewhere else around there also. And also I take the chance to convey a special thanks also to Eleni Sophocleos, the Deus Ex Machina in our collaborations, and to Evi Margaritis that was very brave in confronting the Spanish red tape, and I think you succeeded with flying colors. And just finally a few words on beyond this event on a wider scale. I would like to stress that we are very happy and we value a lot this cooperation we have with the Cyprus Institute. It started in a rather casual way, but now we have had quite a few collaborations, and I would say with very positive results. And I hope we will keep building, we will keep running this cooperation, and because I cannot think of a better platform for exchanges between Spanish and Cypriot scientists and beyond, because as I said, you have very international projection. So thank you very much. Looking forward to hear about the origins of the Mediterranean diet.
Thank you very much. Now I invite Dr. Margaritis to introduce the speaker.
Hello. Before I introduce the speaker, I'll say a few words about the pyre tomorrow. We didn't just wake up one morning and said, okay, we're going to have a pyre, but because we find all this burnt material at the excavations, domestic or ritual, and actually we have a Marie Curie fellowship that Angelos is doing at the moment. He's concluding actually his research, which is how ancient Cypriots burnt their animals on altars. So we thought, okay, this is a research question, and that's why we're going to do the experiment. And the Department of Antiquities hosts us at the Ledri Museum, and we're going to have an experiment, and then Dr. Pilidis at Despo, thank you very much, he's going to actually give us a tour at the museum, which has the finds from a very, very important excavation in the center of Nicosia, and now Dr. Pilidis is in the process of publishing this important work, so I hope that you will join us tomorrow. So, I'll turn to Juanjo now. Juan José García Granero is an archaeobotanist interested in how food systems operated in the past, specifically addressing how prehistoric societies acquired and transformed plant foods. To address these issues, he analyzes mainly starch grains and phytolins, with an emphasis on the degradation of multiple archaeological proxies. His current research focuses mostly on South Asia and the Mediterranean region, but he has conducted archaeobotanical research worldwide, from Scandinavia to sub-Saharan Africa, and from the Americas to Eastern Asia. His PhD completed with summa cum laude at the University of Barcelona in 2015. After working as a postdoctoral research assistant at the University of Pompeu Fabra and the Spanish National Research Council, he was granted a Marie Skłodowska-Curie Individual Fellowship at the School of Archaeology at Oxford to explore culinary practices in the Neolithic and Bronze Age Aegean. He is currently a senior research fellow at the Mila y Fontanalas Institute for Research and Humanities of the Spanish National Research Council, where he acts as head of the Department of Archaeology, Archaeology and Anthropology, directs the research group Human Ecology and Archaeology, and leads projects investigating the prehistoric roots of the Mediterranean diet and the pastoral origins of urban civilization in South Asia. He has more than 50 publications and has delivered over 100 oral and poster presentations in international conferences, and has been invited to present his research in some of the most prestigious research institutions of the world, including the universities of Stanford, Cambridge, Oxford, and now the Cyprus Institute. He has organized several international conferences and workshops, and he's currently organizing the next international meeting on phytolith research, the most important conference on phytolith studies, which will take place in Barcelona in September 2025. He intertwines outreach activities with his research using food as a means to disseminate archaeological research, having led 2 outreach projects and conducted multiple public engagement activities, including talks in libraries and schools, prehistoric cooking workshops, and public gallery talks at the Asmolean Museum in Oxford. His collaboration with the Cyprus Institute dates back to 2016 with the framework of the Keros Archaeological Project, and later as a member of the Urban Project, led by myself, and funded by the Research and Innovation Foundation of Cyprus. Over the last few years, he has hosted several Starcy researchers, conducting research stays at the University of Oxford and the Spanish National Research Council, funded by the British School at Athens and the Erasmus Plus program of the Cyprus Institute. He is currently collaborating with me and other colleagues at the Cyprus Institute in the preparation of a proposal for the next round of the twinning program of the Horizon European Commission program. His talk today is part of his ongoing project, The Prehistoric Roots of the Mediterranean Diet, where he has attested that several elements of what is nowadays regarded as the Mediterranean diet can be traced back to the Bronze Age and, to a degree, the Neolithic. Juanjo, the floor is yours.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. As Dr. Margaritis just said, I'll be talking about an ongoing project taking place at the Spanish National Research Council, which is investigating, as the title said, the prehistoric roots of the Mediterranean diet. Before going into that topic, I think we need to address the elephant in the room. What is the Mediterranean diet? Nobody knows that. And if you're looking for answers, probably you came to the wrong place. Then I will show how archaeological science and archaeometry are helping us understand how old is this dietary pattern. Whatever it is, what do we know from prehistoric materials? And then I'll give a 180-degree turn and talk about what went wrong with the Mediterranean diet. If we assess what we eat today, you will probably find out that none of us in this room adhere to the Mediterranean diet anymore. What went wrong? Finally, how can archaeology help to reverse this trend? And I will talk about the trend and how I think archaeology can address the issue. So, what is the Mediterranean diet? A social construct. We made it up. We absolutely made it up. 60 years ago, or actually 70 years ago now, there was this study called the 7 Countries Study, in which the diet of populations from 7 different countries around the world was compared. And yes, it was beautifully introduced earlier.
I didn't know that.
No, it was. The conclusion of this study was that there was a correlation between cardiovascular disease and diet. And based on that study, which took place in 2 Mediterranean countries among the 7, Italy and Greece, it was found that the dietary pattern of the Mediterranean region, defined as the place where olive trees grow, and this kind of makes sense because also the Mediterranean climate is defined to a degree as where olive trees grow, so this was the definition they used, in the 60s had 4 main characteristics: abundance of plant foods, olive oil as the main source of fat, moderate wine consumption, and low animal fat intake. And that was the conclusion of that study. Based on that, first in Finland and then in the US, the food pyramid was built. And if you are my age, you grew up with this food pyramid. And this food pyramid is wrong. It's so wrong. First, the concept of a pyramid doesn't make any sense, and in nutrition today will tell you that you need a plate, not a pyramid. Second, putting carbohydrates at the base gave us, when we were growing, the wrong impression, the wrong idea that eating pasta was healthy. And I really like pasta. I mean, pizza, any bread is good. But we cannot keep going with this fallacy of I'm having a healthy meal because I'm having a sandwich. I'm not going to go into detail on how should this pyramid be or how the plate I mentioned earlier should be, but let's say that this study has influenced nutrition for at least 40 years, how we see nutrition and how we understand nutrition and how we understand the role fat plays in health. And as said before, nowadays, in the last 20 years, nutritionists are completely changing the focus from fats to sugars, but again, I'm not getting into that. This trend, this beautiful concept of the Mediterranean diet, which was born from nutrition, was picked up by marketing and it exploded. The Mediterranean diet is still regarded as the most healthy, sustainable, balanced, even cheap diet in the world compared to other diets. And these are just 3 examples. There are thousands of books, websites promoting the Mediterranean lifestyle as a healthy lifestyle. However, if we look into what the Mediterranean diet looks like, in reality, there's not one diet, but several. Mediterranean diets are not uniform. If we consider the food habits of the 18 countries that have a coast in the Mediterranean Sea, we can combine them in 4 broad groups. Here you have like Western, Adriatic, Eastern, Cyprus, Greece, Lebanon, Egypt, and North African. And the differences between these 4 groups, within groups things are kind of stable, but the differences are massive. Here you have in this table, you can actually see it, just the cereal intake. Think about rice, for example. We eat rice in the Western Mediterranean, not very often, but we do. Rice is eaten in the Eastern Mediterranean, mostly, I think it says it here, mainly to stuff vegetables in some regions. But they don't eat rice at all in the Northern Africa and the Southern Mediterranean. They eat couscous, which is something we never eat. You have bulgur here. We've never heard of it. It's so exotic for us. You can even find it in the supermarket. Pasta is something relevant if we talk about traditional, so 60 years ago, for Italy and Libya. Libya because of the Italian colonization, not just on their own. So there are huge differences, and I'm just talking about the cereals. There are differences in the type of meat. For example, pork is not eaten in Muslim countries, the amount of fish, the types of vegetables, because we don't have the same vegetables growing in the Eastern and Western Mediterranean, the type and amount of fat or oil. So apparently, in some Mediterranean countries, they don't use oil, olive oil. How is this possible? I mean, this is like, I'm Mediterranean. Of course, I always cook with olive oil. It's not overall trend. Alcohol. Wine, oil, everybody drinks wine, right? No, in Muslim countries, they don't drink wine. So this leads us to question, what does the traditional Mediterranean diet mean? And does it exist? Is the Mediterranean triad, which is made olive oil, wheat for bread, and grape for wine, is it really a regional pattern? Or is it actually a Eurocentric view of the Mediterranean? Did we take 2 countries in the European Mediterranean and aspire for it to be a representation of the whole Mediterranean? Yes, we did. Is this really a regional pattern? Not really. It's, that study I was referring to earlier shows that we have lots of varieties. There are some general trends, and I could talk about them, but instead, I'm going to simplify the argument, because I want to talk about the origins of something. So I'm going to talk about the origins of the traditional Greek diet. And then I change the title of my talk, and it's the prehistoric roots of the Greek diet. Let's simplify. So, different study, again, nutritionists, showing us that this was made with elderly populations all around Greece in rural areas. So it was done 30 years later than the 7 countries study, excuse me, but considering the age difference of the subjects, it would be exactly the same population answering the questions. In this case, instead of just a few in Crete and some other places in Greece, it was more thorough throughout Greece. What this study found is, again, a high ratio of monounsaturated to saturated fat, so basically olive oil, moderate alcohol consumption, mostly with meals, and that would be wine, and high consumption of cereals, mostly in the form of bread. So that is the Mediterranean triad. Okay, so Greece is safe. That study also found beyond the triad high consumption of legumes, fruits and vegetables, and low consumption of meat and meat products and milk and dairy products. So again, overall, it fits this pattern observed initially of low saturated fat, olive oil, but this is just for Greece, not for the whole Mediterranean. Okay, now that we have a pattern, if not for the whole region, at least for one country, how old is it? How far can we trace back this pattern? The origins of this pattern are usually set in the Middle Ages. Some researchers, some historians say in antiquity, and we can think about the expansion of the triad during antiquity. Wheat had been there since the Neolithic, but wine and olive oil arrived to Western Mediterranean thanks to the Phoenicians. So it's kind of, they got there slightly earlier than the Greeks, but it's kind of the same time period. So it's again, antiquity makes sense. However, my argument today is that the roots can be traced back to the prehistoric times. If we think about the Bronze Age, we have multiple examples of, again, wheat had been there since the Neolithic, no question, but olive oil production, and actually it was Dr. Margaritis who made a review 11 years ago now, showing how proper botanical sampling aided in the identification of olive oil production. And then we have some evidence of wine. Also, in this case, the examples reference here is from Bronze Age Italy. So we can see that during the Bronze Age, most of the Mediterranean already had olive oil, wheat for sure, and wine. Western Mediterranean would take a bit longer. It's kind of the Iron Age, a few years later, a few hundreds of years later, but it's kind of there. But if we go way back in time to the Neolithic, there's evidence, if not as conclusive, suggesting that winemaking, olive oil production, and bulgur and trahanas, which are 2 traditional meals in the Eastern Mediterranean made of cereals, were already being produced during this time. Here you have the dates and the places you can check. And actually, bread making, the actual making of bread, has been attested 400,000 years ago. 14,400 years ago. Yes, I made that, like some early Homo was doing this. No. Bread making in the Levant, and that is one case study. We don't have a lot of evidence about that, but we can see that the Neolithic is there. So the Mediterranean triad is present since at least the Neolithic. However, when we defined the traditional Greek diet, we didn't only focus on the 3 main ingredients. We also talk about legumes, fruits, and vegetables. Now, legumes, again, plenty of evidence in the Neolithic. I'm not going to cover that. It's there. Fruits, vegetables have an issue with archaeological visibility that I will talk about later. Meat and meat products and milk and dairy products have the opposite issue. They are way overrepresented in the archaeological record. So if you think about how we excavate and how we recover bioarchaeological material, bones, you can see them. They are there. And they are almost always picked up. As the archaeobotanists in the room know, seeds, not that much. You have to actually go for them. You have to look for them, implement sampling strategies to find them. This has led to an oversimplification of past diets, not only in Greece, not only in the Mediterranean, but worldwide, which overemphasizes the role of meat and meat products in the diet of prehistoric populations. With milk and dairy products, it's not the narrative is not so simple, but the conclusion is kind of the same. milk and dairy products can only be identified through chemical analysis. When they are present as chemical residues, mostly I'm talking about vessels, pottery vessels, they basically overrule any other type of residue or chemical signal that is in that vessel, including plant fats or plant waxes, and also the significance of the find overshadows any other find in that study. If a study found milk, then the publication is going to be about milk, even if milk was found in one pot. And this has happened and will still happening because it's actually very cool that people found milk and were actually using milk as early as they were doing. But this has created, again, biased narratives. Going back to fruits and vegetables here, their use has been textually documented for over 3,000 years in the Eastern Mediterranean. And we can think about tombs in Egypt with hieroglyphic writing depicting even recipes, or linear B tablets depicting the amounts of specific herbs or spices that were entering the Minoan and Mycenaean palaces. So we know they were there. We know they were being used. However, they are heavily underrepresented. The reason for this is twofold. First, many of these foodstuffs don't need to get to be in contact with fire to be eaten before. Think about strolling through the forest, you find a berry, you eat it. You're not going to put it on a fireplace. That results in archaeological invisibility. There's no remain in the site. And many of these foodstuffs, when they get in contact with fire, they actually get destroyed, not preserved. So it's a double bias here of if they don't get in touch with fire, they won't be preserved. If they do, they will be destroyed. So it's kind of quite invisible. A way to solve this dilemma is looking for alternative evidence, in this case, microscopic plant remains, which, and specifically I'm going to talk about my topic, starch grains and phytoliths, which are two different types of microscopic plant remains. If they are recovered, or when they are recovered for food-related artifacts, they provide direct evidence in a similar way to chemical analysis from vessels, pottery vessels. Direct evidence of the use of these less common or less visible plant foodstuffs, fruits, leaf and root vegetables, herbs, and spices. Here is an example. There are many. There are people in this room who have been conducting microbotanical research in the last few years, and there's a piling body of evidence for the use of some of these resources. In this case, is a former PhD student of mine, Evgenia Tsafu. As part of her PhD, she found starch grains from root vegetables and spices in pottery cooking vessels from Bronze Age Crete. However, in order for these approaches to be really, really useful, we need comprehensive region-specific reference collections. And I just put this here because I think it's very cool an image. This was done by a colleague of mine as part of a study which is currently being reviewed for publication. And these are phytoliths from Mediterranean herbs such as mint, oregano, and I think it's very cool. Unfortunately, these types of phytoliths are not unique to this species, so we still have to find more evidence, or we would need supporting evidence to say that these represent herbs in an archaeological context. Now, what went wrong? Everything was fine. We've been eating the same stuff since the Neolithic. It works, it's tasty, it's good. You know, like, I really like the Mediterranean food. However, the younger generations, and I'm not included, I'm purposefully excluding myself from these younger generations, have replaced what is considered the traditional Mediterranean diet, however we want to define it. We could say the traditional Greek or Spanish. This has happened in every single country throughout the Mediterranean, with one rich in saturated fat and processed sugar. This is called as nutrition transition, is known as nutrition transition, or westernization of the diet. And it's not only happening in the Mediterranean, it's happening everywhere at different rates. In Asia, the youth are more and more consuming a westernized version of a diet, which results in diet-related chronic diseases such as obesity, cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, cancer, etc., etc. Not only is it bad for us, it's also bad for the environment, specifically in terms of water use and greenhouse gas emissions. And it's also, and as archaeologists, we should be very worried about this, results in cultural loss, because cuisine is part of our biocultural heritage. So, can we do something about this? Can we, as archaeologists, help in reverse this trend? First, let's see what policymakers are doing. There are two options, two strategies that have been implemented: education policies and interventionist policies. Education would be informing the public, this is bad for you. Interventionists would be like, I'm going to tax sugary drinks, I'm going to forbid them in high schools or primary schools, I'm going to incentive other types of drinks or other types of foods. However, this is not working. The trend is not changing. These policies have been in place for the last 20 years, and the trends are not reversing, on the contrary. So we need to look for alternatives. One alternative of promotion of healthy foods has been found by the private sector. I don't know if you've heard of kamut, which is actually known as Khorasan wheat, which is a known type of wheat, often marketed as the ancient grain for modern life. This wheat has been known for many, many years, thousands of years. It's not something new. It has always been produced only in a tiny region of Iran, and these people in the US took it and absolutely made it look like the best new thing. Like, I would say the new quinoa, but it came before quinoa trend, so the pre-quinoa trend. This wheat, it's true that it's less genetically modified than most of the bread wheat we get, so in that sense it's healthy, but it's not healthier than emmer or einkorn, which have been around and had for many, many years, thousands, and are slowly disappearing from our diets, if not completely. Another example from Spain is the biscuits chiquilin, which it's biscuits that have been around for many years, but a few years ago they launched their millenary cereal biscuits. And they chose rye and spelt wheat as millenary cereals. I would argue that any cereal is millenary because we've been eating all of them, many of them, for 10,000 years now. So this is just marketing. This is using the perceived antiquity or the real antiquity of these foodstuffs to promote them. So this makes me believe that perceiving a foodstuff as ancient increases its desirability. It's not old, it's ancient, it's millenary. That's kind of, interesting. Amazes me, again, think that creating awareness of the millenary tradition of the Mediterranean diet can make it appealing to the public. So it's not just, hey, we have been eating these for many years, but actually going out there and explaining this to people. I have here some pictures of average activities I have been conducting in the last few years. Cooking workshops. This is a Neolithic recipe from Çatalhöyük. This was based on some remains found. Some get to know your foodstuff with cereals and pulses. People eat, and this is with kids and the elderly as well. Again, another picture from the cooking workshop, explaining, I don't know what we're trying with it. I think this was a Neolithic with a metal pot because the chef thought that would be cool. I was like, okay, I let it slide because this is outreach, but I have to explain this is not happening. So I've been talking about many things. I want to summarize my talk, and I know I've been a bit quick, so I'm happy to explain everything in detail later. Several elements and modes of preparation of what is nowadays considered the Mediterranean diet. And by elements, I mean like low-fat intake, heavy reliance on plant foodstuffs, modes of preparation, we could say bread making, wine making, olive making, but also the furnace, the Roman furnace, the oven as a way of cooking. They were already present across the Mediterranean during prehistoric times. However, a progressive shift away from these traditional dietary patterns, and it says healthy I would say, healthy and sustainable dietary patterns has been observed over the last 6 decades, in the 60s, in some regions in North Africa in the last 20, 30 years, so it's even more recent. Understanding the deep history of Mediterranean culinary practices and diet can aid in the preservation and promotion. And finally, outreach and transfer of knowledge are absolutely fundamental to achieve this goal, preservation and promotion of traditional diets. I have before me an audience of young researchers. I don't know if you've ever done any outreach activity. If you haven't, go out there. It's very rewarding, it's very informative, and it's fundamental. I have been doing this for a few years now. I don't understand my research anymore if I don't go and explain to people what I'm doing. Explain in a way that everybody can understand and contribute to this knowledge. Why have you been researching this? I don't know, don't ask me these questions, right? These kind of questions with the kids, with any population, they make you kind of reconsider why you're researching what you are researching and what its value to society. Okay, to finish, I want to thank my funding, of course, but also the Spanish Embassy in Nicosia for hosting us today, the Cyprus Institute, the organizers of this workshop, and thank you very much for your attention. Now, I know I've covered many topics. Please, any questions you may have?
Thank you very much. I have a question, although you didn't touch on it, but about the local diet. You mentioned trahanas and bulgur. Now, trahanas, obviously, in order to make it, you need milk. So, and you date it hundreds of years, or if not thousands of years back. So that comes with another message, that people were obviously using milk, domesticated small ruminants. And although Angelos will probably say something of this, but I think it's actually quite interesting which source of milk, because all the animals that we have now are mainly imported breeds and so on. So it gives out information. So it's very, very interesting to know, how many years you date it back, and whether you have information about the animals people were using to make that.
So, not me, not my research. It's a research by colleagues at the University of Thessaloniki, who have identified bulgur and trahanas in Neolithic context in northern Greece and Bulgaria. And in regards to these species that were used to produce dairy products, I would like to pass the microphone to my colleague, archaeologist, who will perfectly answer your question way better than I would.
It's true that there is evidence for milking since the Neolithic. There is no evidence for the specialization on dairy products since the Neolithic, but the use of the milk is certain. We can see it also from the mortality profiles of animals, because a herd that is exploited for the milk will have a different mortality pattern than a herd that is of sheep, for example, that is exploited for meat. So we start in the Neolithic seeing some deviation from the meat model, which shows some concern to diversify the products that you extract from the animals. So it's certain that milk was used since the Neolithic. I would say that the breed is impossible currently to distinguish. We would be happy to distinguish the species if it's, for example, caprine or bovine. That can be done, but not the breed of, let's say, the cattle or the sheep from the milk. Sometimes it's very difficult to distinguish sheep from goat milk, because they are both caprines. So a breed is a much smaller distance genetically to be distinguishable than species. And the other, I will also, since I have the mic, I add the fact that, yes, bones are overrepresented as opposed to plant remains, but the archaeologists have used other lines of evidence, especially from ethnographic observations in more recent traditional Mediterranean practices, to say that meat is not so commonly consumed. And also, stable isotope analysis on human remains will give you the level of meat versus plant consumption. So it's another index that you can use independent from the biases of preservation. And that's all I've used too long.
I'm going to comment on the isotope comment. The issue with isotopes is that often isotope analysis on human remains are done isolated from isotope analysis on plant remains, and we are often missing the influence manuring may have had on nitrogen levels, which completely change its trophic level. And I'm sure we have an overrepresentation of meat-based populations that were consuming plant crops that were manured. Manures, the dung from animals, would be used to, I'm trying to find the word, to boost the productivity of the plant crops. And that increases the nitrogen levels, which changes the nitrogen signal, isotopic signal in human bones and teeth, thus resulting on what looks like a meat-based diet. So and this has been solved by analyzing isotopes from plants, animals, and humans from the same site, which unfortunately is almost never done. It's most of the data we have to date comes from only humans from a single site. Nowadays, more increasingly, humans and some animals for reference, not so common to add also some plants.
Hi, thank you for the exposition. You mentioned the westernization of the nutrition. Do you think this concept is correct or may misrepresent what is actually happened? Because it seems this new diet that is being adopted, it may be coming from the United States. That would be more precise, no? Because as portraying the westernization, that would include Europe and so on. And
the name comes from, that's why I didn't write it down. I write nutrition transition, which is what most people would use. People in the US would say westernization of the diet. And it comes from the States, but also in a way from Northern Europe. There was mention earlier from the diet of Finland and Scandinavia in general, which is not fast food, but it's heavier on not only saturated fat, but also sugars. And that is, that is the diet that went to the United States 200 years ago, and now is kind of expanding everywhere.
But it has been transformed in these 200 years.
It has been transformed enormously, yeah.
I don't think an Italian would say that an American pizza qualifies as Italian pizza.
There was...
Good evening, and thank you very much for this enlightening presentation. It seems like we still have some hope. I will just make two questions on two of your slides. One is about what went wrong, and of course, my colleague there, he touched upon, when we say the younger generations, is it in the last 50 years or 30 years? Because 55 years ago, when I was growing up here, or even 60, our diet was quite Mediterranean, quite authentic, local, and certainly we didn't miss anything. But then rather quickly it has penetrated. And the next one, which is relevant, what are the responses and how can, you mentioned the transition that has to be done and interventionist policies in schools. This sounds like a, let's say, communist or whatever. How can we do this today in a society, in an economy, which is very much free economy, and of course you don't dare to impose anything on free, let's say, choice. And of course the tax disincentives, if you may elaborate. Thank you very much.
So the transition, depending on where we're talking North Mediterranean, so the European Mediterranean, it started 60 years ago, and it may not be evident when you're doing it, but I have, for example, data on legume consumption for Spain between the 60s and up to 2020 or 19. And you can see a steady decrease resulting in 60 years in a decrease down to a third of the original. And this is plant protein that has been substituted by meat protein. So it's not something that happened in one generation, it happened throughout 2 generations. And I probably, if we compare the diet you have when you were young and the diet I have when I was young and the diet my kids have today, we can see a difference, clear-cut difference. But if we go into the middle, we see it's progressive. Second question. Sorry, I'm very bad at remembering questions. Can you remind me what it is?
It's about the foreign interventions policies.
Yes.
Tax disincentives.
So we've tried this, increasing taxes in sugary drinks. We tax tobacco a lot, and it has resulted in many countries in a decrease of the percentage of the population who smokes. So as free market countries, we still do this. It's not, and I wasn't necessarily advocating for that. I was actually saying that this has been tried and it's not really working. Also, there are lots of issues here, like often the less healthy meals are the cheapest ones, and the people who have less resources is the only meals they can actually access to. And then if you increase the price by increasing the tax, what you're doing is limiting their access to food and then therefore to nutrients. So there are a lot of things to consider here. What is a healthy diet more expensive than an unhealthy one nowadays? And that has to do with many things that I don't think we can cover in 5 minutes. But what I was trying to say is that didn't work. Let's try something different. Let's try to show people how interesting this can be. And in my experience with outreach activities, when you tell people lentils have been around for almost, in Spain, 8,000 years, suddenly they're like, what? You know, lentils? That's, we have a saying in Spain, and I'm not going to try to translate it, but what it means is that lentils are something for the old females from grains, you know, it's like, and if you want them, you eat them, otherwise you leave them, because it says, I don't care, right? This is not really tasty or nice. Then I tell people, 7,800 years ago, lentils arrived to the northeastern part of Spain, and people are like, lentils are that old? You know, like, so we have been eating lentils too for almost 8,000 years. Another day, I was telling them, I cooked the other day a lentil stew, and I added olive oil, and I added some garlic, I'm a vegetarian, so no meat, some courgette. I had several different ingredients that I added to my stew. And then I said, I represented the history of a Spanish cuisine in a single meal without even realizing, because I started with the Neolithic, went through the Iron Age with olive oil, then the Romans brought some stuff, the Muslims brought some stuff, the other stuff came from America, and I put everything in a single meal without even noticing. So for me to be able to cook this meal, all these things had to happen. And then people were like, that is very cool. It's no longer a plate of lentils, it's history on a plate. That's very powerful, actually, because when you feed people, you can tell them whatever you want, they will listen, and they will trust you. And I have done this. That's why I do cooking workshops. I can explain anything. Archaeological chemistry, which is not my topic, and people were like, very nice, you know. So it's the power of a meal, and, you know, most of the people here, if not all of us, are Mediterraneans. We understand this. We understand the importance of a meal. So I think we can, as archaeologists, use that, or I like to use that, to transfer all this knowledge we have about the past. There was a question over there.
Multi-layered question to link what you showed with sort of my expertise. In the time span that you presented, one thing that changed is climate. So I'm wondering how the changing climate affected culinary tradition, or how it affected food, okay? So that's one. And you also mentioned westernization.
Can we do one at
No,
a
no,
time?
wait.
I really get them mixed up.
Okay. Okay.
So there's a term I didn't throw out there, which I kind of made up. It's culinary resilience, the ability of a cuisine to adapt to changes. May them be external, like climate change, or internal, like, let's say, a crisis, a food shortage. And if we look at the history of the Mediterranean throughout the last 10,000 years, we've had climate change, we had population movements, and sometimes complete replacements. We've had wars, famines, we have every single thing. We had the arrival of new foodstuffs. Think about America. The arrival to America and what it meant. Basically, it took a while, but in the 18th century, everything that came. And still, I would argue that the Mediterranean diet and how Mediterraneans see and cook food has been stable to a degree for the last 10,000 years. And this is an argument that probably will take us a bit longer to develop, but I'm happy to elaborate if that's something you want me to do. But this would be that's a hypothesis, a working hypothesis. But even though we've had climate change, Mediterranean populations have adapted very well, and we don't see major changes, for example, in cereal and pulse production and consumption through time. And wheat is not that adaptable often. But different wheat varieties, we're talking about breeds earlier, we don't call them breeds with crops, but different varieties are more or less adapted to certain climatic conditions. And you would find this specialization in this valley they cultivated, not anymore, not since the Green Revolution, but they cultivated this specific variety because it was very well adapted to, it doesn't rain much, but then it rains just at this time of the year. Then, you have that wheat variety that has evolved, co-evolved with humans for hundreds of years and is perfectly adapted. So I would say that Mediterranean diet has been quite resilient to climate change and other external and internal factors. Yeah. Second question.
Sort of answered, and then there comes what you mentioned, westernization, which is also a social change. Mm-hmm. And gone through a lot of social changes in the presenting Romans, Arabs, Turks, Persians, and so the question would be, what in the end of all of this, the climate had an impact, or the social had more of an impact? And that would be.
So I think it's food and not people had to fight against many forces, and social change, as I said earlier, complete population changes. But still, I think there's a degree of environmental determinism, and I hope nobody kills me, but if something is working here in this particular valley, changing it is very hard because you're fighting against the elements to grow something else. And we have the example of the Romans. They got to the Negev desert and they say, we're going to grow wine and we're going to grow bread here. And they managed for a little sort of span of time to grow wheat and grapes in the Negev desert, but it didn't really last long because it's just not the place to grow these things. It just doesn't work. So there are constraints to what you can grow, and then therefore what you can eat. And if something works, then why change it? At the same time, there's a clear-cut cultural difference. We have and this comes from ethnobotanical research. We have often the same wild plants growing in different areas of the Mediterranean, but people in one region would gather and eat them, and people in the other region, they don't. And this is something that is passed on through generations. So there's this mixture of what can be grown and what people like to eat. And then I'm not answering your question. I'm making it maybe more complex, but this interplay is what ends up resulting in a cuisine, in a way. Yep.
Hello. Thank you very much for your talk. I am an archaeologist, but I think that nutrition is one of my other passions, so it was very interesting for me. And I feel that in my generation, at least, people are starting to be more concerned about nutrition, about their eating habits, and trying to eat more healthy in general. And so I was curious to know if you have any experience dealing with a younger audience, maybe children or teenagers, and how are their perceptions of these and of nutrition and.
So this particular experience comes from an interaction with 10-year-olds. I did an exercise in which I asked half the group to write down and then share with all the group food they like. And then the other half to write down food their grandparents liked when they were their age. So I was kind of bridging this 60-year gap. Obviously, there was a huge difference, and we saw, and they saw it. They saw the globalization. They liked things that were not traditional, and how less healthy and more sugary their preferences were compared to what the other half of the group thought their grandparents would have eaten and would have liked, right? When confronted with this evidence, they admitted they know a lot about what healthy diet is, way more than I did at their age. They know about the basic nutrition, not so much about sustainability, but they are young, not there yet, but then they were like, but it's so good. So it all comes down to the fact that sugar acts as a drug in our brain, and it's very good, and we really like it, and we like how, it makes us feel. So it's very hard to fight, and all the demonization of fat, again, getting into another topic, but a lot of it was promoted by sugar companies, it's demonized fat, so we are free to keep doing what we're doing. And for the last 60 years, we've been increasing drastically the amount of sugar we consume, and it's very hard to get out of there. So even though younger generations are more informed, we know more about nutrition than we ever knew, still it's tasty. So that's the answer I've gotten.
Thank you very much for your very interesting talk. I'm not an archaeologist, I'm actually a nutritionist, and I have very maybe simple question for all of us, for all this audience. Do you have any idea of ethanol percentage in wine from prehistoric time?
Wine.
Wine or alcoholic fermented beverages?
That's a very tricky question, because we can detect archaeologically fermentation, but fermentation can happen naturally. If you leave a fruit in a vessel and it rots, it ferments. And that's what you can detect archaeologically. So the data we have for wine is always, if you have a Roman amphora that we know through textual evidence that we use for wine, and you have this chemical marker for fermentation, then you're going to be very confident that there was wine there. If you go back to the Neolithic, it could be any fruit, not any, but a series of fruits that went bad. So trying to extrapolate percentages from archaeological data in prehistory is incredibly hard and dangerous. I would say the same about plants, even animals. There's a lot of biases. So archaeologists spend a lot of time using different statistics to try to understand what the data actually means. Like, I have a lot of bones from small mammals, but when I add up the kilos of these animals, it actually amounts to a cow. And I have 3 cows, so actually I have more cow meat. So this is a very simplistic, forgive me. So trying to extrapolate archaeological data to make percentages. I remember when I was a student, I'm studying starch, we have lipids, and we now have proteins. We could actually make like a plate like they do nutritionists nowadays. That doesn't make any sense. How am I going to, like, everything is so biased and so random to a degree. When I find starch, I'm not saying that because I found more of these, it was more common. I'm just saying I found more of these because I don't know what happened through the last 5,000 years to that particular starch assemblage that could have affected its representation of the actual past. Did that make sense? Yeah. So unfortunately, no, we don't have. The short answer would be no. I could have gone for that. Any other question?
No. Thank you very much indeed, Juanjo.